It's Monday morning and I'm here at the White Knights campus of the University of Reading. And this is what was referred to as White Knights House, is now referred to as Old White Knights House, and this was the first home to the Merle back in 1951. The university had just acquired the White Knights campus at that point, mid-20th century, and was keen to build academic departments. The founders of the museum, meanwhile, were keen to establish a folklife museum, an open-air site akin to those sites like Skansen in Scandinavia, in Sweden, that had inspired their project. Sadly for our purposes, the university won out and built academic departments, and we didn't end up with an open-air museum. What we did end up with was a thriving museum project that was very rapidly filled up. So by 1955, this site had opened as a public museum, and throughout the 1950s, as we've heard already in relation to that Schillingford visit in 1956 and other visits to royal shows, the museum had a peripatetic set of public displays. Larger objects like the wagons, of course, would never have fitted in this building, and so were stored outside under cover and in makeshift ways. And by the late 1960s, the museum had very much outgrown this site. And as a consequence, it had to move. So very early on in the museum's history, it moved from White Knights House here on the White Knights campus across to a series of temporary buildings over here. And we'll take a walk across there now. In 1954, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, did a live TV broadcast from this site, with the founding father of a BBC radio serial called The Archers, Godfrey Bazley, presiding over a presentation with his friend and colleague John Higgs, one of the founders of the Merle. So up on this site were demonstrations of the museum's equipment, including, for those of you who made it to the Commons event yesterday, the threshing fan that Amanda Couch's work is displayed in front of in the museum, but also wagons. The portable steam engine was stoked and firing, and other objects and collections. The site we're coming across to now is currently another academic department, but this is a relatively recent building. And actually the museum stayed in a series of effectively temporary accommodation huts from the late 1960s through to 2004, when it moved down the road to the London Road campus, the current home of the museum, and where I've been broadcasting to you all during the Congress. And this temporary accommodation obviously proved out to be not quite as temporary as they'd imagined, but the temporary accommodation became known as the Rural History Centre, which housed within it the Museum of English Rural Life. So some of you may remember this building, or rather the buildings that used to sit here, as being the Rural History Centre. And what's nice about this for our purposes is that the Rural History Centre as was, and the Museum of English Rural Life temporary accommodation, was home to the International Association of Agricultural Museums Congress in 1976. So the 4th Congress of our organisation. And there's little here to remind us of that event and of the museum having been on this site, except for this cider mill. This cider mill was never accessioned into the museum's collections because it came from a local builder's yard and had little or no context. And it proved too difficult and heavy to move down to the current site back in 2004, and so it wasn't incorporated into the new public site that opened on that London Road campus in 2005. And it stands here as testament to the fact that the Museum of English Rural Life was once up here on the campus, the White Knights campus of the University of Reading.
Well, I think it's time to get started again. So welcome back to day 5 of the AIMA Congress, Past and Future Agricultures. I'm Isabel Hughes and I'm Associate Director here at Merle and Vice President of AIMA, and it's my pleasure to welcome you again. Some of you will have seen all of the film. Some of you will have come into the tail end of the film Ollie, my colleague and president, has made about our site. If you want to see it in full again, it will be posted in the chat and then you can look at it at your leisure. So we will be having today the final session followed by the General Assembly. And as you know, it's been difficult to have our formal General Assembly given that we can't meet face to face. So long-standing members will know that we've sent out the papers some time ago with the opportunity to vote on adopting the papers. Those of you who have joined very recently, you may want to look at the papers again in the link which Ollie has put in the chat. So there's a Dropbox link, and if you want to refresh your memory about the papers before the AGM, please do have a look at that link and you can see the papers for yourself again. A few housekeeping arrangements. This event, as you all know, is being recorded, and so it would help us, for those of you who don't have the right name on your profile picture, it would help if you could name yourself exactly who you are. That helps us all. If you are speaking, we like you to have your camera on so we can locate you, but do mute yourself until the point when you are speaking yourself. And everyone else, please keep your cameras and your microphones off for the presentations. The presentations have been pre-recorded and we will be playing them with English subtitles. But if you want to translate the subtitles, you can always look for the link to the presentation in the chat function, open that, and then you can do automatic translate into any number of languages using YouTube. If you want to see the programme, we have had to make 1 or 2 changes to not so much the speakers, but some of the films. Please look at the Merle website and you'll find a link to the most up-to-date part of the programme. So I think that more or less covers everything I wanted to say. I'm delighted to introduce Kerry-Leigh Burchill. I'm sure she needs no introduction. She's a fantastic AIMA member and very lively committee member, as I know well. And I'd like to pass over to Kerry-Leigh to introduce the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel, and good morning from Canada. I'll wish you all a good morning. I know for some of you, it's I hope you're having a pleasant day or that you're wrapping up your day with us. And I'm very honored to have been asked to chair session 10, Understanding Museum Objects and Sites. This morning's session is a brilliantly eclectic ensemble of museum professionals who have researched, educated, and collaborated in Portugal, the United Kingdom, Spain, Norway, and France. I believe this panel represents the broad diversity of intentions and functions and roles that agricultural museums play in society. Collectively, we are stewards of objects and images of practice and premise, of visitor experience and academic rigor that record and interpret milestones in societal evolution as it pertains to agricultural topics and key issues of our time, such as cultural preservation, food security, and environmental stability. Without further ado, because I'm sure you're quite a bit more interested in hearing from our panel of experts, I'd like to give a brief introduction and then we will run through their presentations. After their presentations, we will have an opportunity for a question and answer session, and I will be happy to keep an eye on the chat for those questions. So feel free at any point during the presentations to insert your questions into the chat. First up, we will be hearing from Joao Joaquim. He's currently a PhD student in the history and philosophy of science at the University of Cambridge. His background is in agricultural science in a Portuguese context, although he has more recently been studying plant virus research and the transnational network that the International Association of Agriculture Museums has been contributing to over the last few decades. Marie-Christine Aubin is a well-known researcher and long-time contributor to AIMA on discussions of material culture in agricultural heritage and food literacy contexts. Anne Join Freuen is the curator of history at the Museet in Nerbo, Norway. I'm sure you will agree with me. I could listen to Anne for days. I always find her presentations extremely interesting. She's known for insightful exhibitions and programs that examine the socioeconomic and ethical issues surrounding agricultural practice. And today she will be speaking to us about the use of pesticides. Abel Verneau is the Deputy Secretary General of the Museum of the Agricultural Machinery and Rurality in Bourgogne, France. His institution blends an extraordinary collection of technology alongside a conservatory orchard. As you can hear, this should prove to be a very interesting session, not only of presentations, but of discussions immediately following.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me in this Congress. This presentation covers some of the research I've recently done on the history of agriculture museums. Here, I focus especially on the origins and creation of the International Association of Agricultural Museums, known by the abbreviation of its French name as the AIMA. This association presents itself as an ideal case study for the examination of the transnational history of agricultural museology, with special attention to the establishment of knowledge networks, the role of experts, the transfer of theories and concepts, and the emergence of common policy issues. Founded in 1966 in Czechoslovakia and involving actors on both sides of the Iron Curtain, the AIMA started in that same year to organize international congresses, which were alternately held by West and East Bloc countries every 2 or 3 years. These international congresses attract a multitude of experts, ethnographers, historians, geographers, agricultural scientists, and even the occasional museum professional. For the study of the proceedings of these congresses, published between 1966 and 1989, one can access an important narrative source of the ideas, plans, and ambitions of museum professionals and historians of agriculture throughout several decades. My research was also based on publications by international organizations concerned with cultural and even specifically museological issues, such as UNESCO and ICOM, International Council of Museums. Having presented the framework of my research, let us now take a step back in time to the early days of agricultural museology. As many other kinds of museums, the origins of agricultural museums can be partially found in late 19th century world exhibitions. Among the many institutions started in the aftermath of these events were 2 that were especially influential: the Skansen Open Air Museum in Stockholm, an innovative folklore museum, and the Hungarian Agriculture Museum in Budapest, a national museum with a markedly technical character, both founded in the 1890s. These were pioneer institutions which acted as role models for later initiatives around Europe and beyond. Oh, sorry, got it. Here you can see photos of a couple of exhibition rooms at the Hungarian Museum and a display prepared by Hezelius, the founder of the Skansen, at the World Exhibition in the 1870s. But we'll focus our attention on a third institution, the Czechoslovak National Agricultural Museum, which took shape immediately after the independence of the state in 1918 and was partially based on the example of the Hungarian Agriculture Museum. The positivist spirit of its curators and directors meant that its exhibitions were not considered as an ethnographic nostalgic display of artifacts, but as a practical educational tool to be used in the technical development of these new independent states. Notice how at the Czechoslovak Museum the emphasis is on the display of matters such as animal and plant breeding. In states where modernization advanced at a faster pace, agricultural museums were often retrospective in its content and closely associated with ethnographic and folklore collections, such was the case in Scandinavia and some other countries in Western Europe. Central European states, newly independent after the First World War, saw things differently, and modern, rather than traditional agriculture, was underscored. While open-air museums could build on the cachet of well-established fields of research and had increasingly become popular as recreational spaces, museums focused on the history of agricultural technology struggled to assert themselves outside of Central Europe. It is in this context that the early roots of the AIMA can be found. If we consider this association as one more transnational organization concerned with agricultural matters, one can easily integrate it into a long tradition of expert conferences and societies dating back to the late 19th century. Moreover, interwar Czechoslovakia was the site in 1927 of the creation of the Green International, a league of European agrarian parties. Significantly, Czechoslovak politics were, in those years, dominated by an agrarian party. It is thus unsurprising that Czechoslovak museum professionals, supported by agrarian-minded politicians, starting in the 1930s, flouting the idea of creating an international organization of agricultural museums, promoting a first survey of these kind of institutions. The project was postponed sine die by the Second World War, when several Central and Eastern European museums of agricultural technology were destroyed, damaged, or dispersed. Now we have a map. This map represents the institutions mentioned in the surveys organized by the Czechoslovak Museum. The points are placed randomly within the countries and do not indicate the exact location of the institutions. The dates, when indicated, are those of the foundation of the museums. Across the icon, as seen in Germany, Poland, and Russia, indicate institutions that did not survive Second World War. This map is not intended to be an exact representation of agricultural museums in 1960s Europe, but as an illustration of the network of institutions that the Czechoslovak Museum knew of and interacted with in Europe. Albeit occasionally interrupted by political vicissitudes throughout the 1950s, increasing contacts between agricultural museums allowed for the organization of conferences, meetings, and field visits involving the staff of different institutions around Central and Northern Europe. This was made possible by the common interest of museums of technical agriculture and open-air museums in the history of cataloging agricultural implements, and the history and cataloging of agricultural implements, a meeting point of ethnologists, agricultural engineers, and historians. These photos showcase the common interest in the history of agricultural implements in both Eastern and Western Bloc institutions. In this case, the Czechoslovak Museum and the Museum of English Rural Life, the MERL, that is hosting this Congress today. The creation of the AIMA resulted from the cooperation between the Czechoslovak and the Hungarian Museums of Agriculture. The latter, considered as one of the oldest and most comprehensive in the world, gave considerable credibility to the project. Zdenek Tempier, director of the Czechoslovak Museum and one of the founders of the AIMA, chronicled its creation as a continuation of the museum's interwar project and the triumph of international cooperation at a time of political division. However, Ted Collins, who attended many of the early congresses as a representative of the MERL, remarked that most papers were unimaginative and concerned familiar agricultural history themes, with possible divisive topics like socialist agriculture or farm collectivization being mostly absent from the congresses. Collins further noted that disagreements between Western and Eastern delegations sometimes occurred, particularly in what concerned the administration of the association. This map indicates the countries in which AIMA congresses were organized between 1966 and 1989. The statutes of the AIMA were jointly written by the staff of the Czechoslovak Museum and Gunther Franz, director of Hohenheim University's Institute of Agricultural History in West Germany. It is quite noticeable that there was an attempt to balance the influence of Western and Eastern Bloc institutions inside of the association. Interestingly enough, Soviet representations to the congresses were small and unremarkable, and Russian, despite being jointly with English, French, and German, one of the official languages of the organization, was hardly ever used during the congresses. Based on Koevo examples, this can be attributed to the reluctance of the Soviet state apparatus in allowing the access of its museum professionals to academic events taking place in the Western Bloc. This situation was something that distressed Tempier and other Eastern Bloc professionals who strove in the early years of the association to maintain a strict balance between both sides of the geopolitical divide. Nothing was left to chance. For example, the structuring of the AIMA as an independent organization affiliated with ICOM, but not as an ICOM committee, was a deliberate choice. This maximized opportunities for Eastern Bloc museum professionals to take part in international meetings where they would have otherwise been replaced by government officials. They had thus successfully created a transnational network over which they kept a reasonable level of control, providing them access to publications, travel opportunities, and an international cachet of respectability that could even be mobilized in the context of negotiations with state apparatuses. Knowing this, it is easily understandable why Eastern Bloc national museums of agriculture with a strong technical emphasis remain one of the main components of the association up to 1989. This did not discourage Scandinavian and Western European ethnology or open-air museums from taking part in the association, but conflicting perspectives on museum work, as well as occasional political constraints, led to the creation of Western Bloc-based competing organizations focused specifically on this kind of institutions. Of course, that the 1970s and 1980s brought some changes to the thematic focuses of the congresses, as well as the membership and structure of the AIMA. Nevertheless, 1989 appears to have been the real turning point for an association which had been imagined in a geopolitical context that was no more. Thank you for your attention.
Hello everyone, I am Marie-Christine Aubin from France. I am an independent researcher. I will let my friend Sue narrate on my behalf.
Presented to you are advertisements created by the Chilean producers on soda nitrate. Summarizing the National Archive's 1,300,000 documents is nearly impossible for today's presentation, but I want to show you the impact soda nitrate sales has had on Chile and her people. Between 1880 and 1930, soda nitrate was the principal fertilizer used all over the world. On the map, there are green areas indicating 47 buying countries. Nitrate trade actually began in 1830 with 800 tons, but after the Pacific War, its expansion grew. The war took place between 1879 and 1884. Owners of the nitrate deposits in the Maritime Department of Bolivia were mainly Chilean. When export of soda nitrate was heavily taxed, war broke out. Peru and Bolivia lost the war. Chile now ruled the regions of Tarapacá of Peru and Antofagasta of Bolivia. These two regions in the Atacama Desert were the main deposits of soda nitrate, marked in black in the map on the right. On the left, I integrated the poster concerning the guano of Peru, since it was the first natural fertilizer of world scope during the period between 1845 and 1875. During the same period, the exploitation of nitrate deposits progressed, going from the first industrial process developed by Tadeo Henk in the Paradas in 1809 to that developed in 1866 by Pedro Gamboni in the Oficinas, new name given to the extraction and processing centers of the caliche. The caliche is the name of the hard rock from which soda nitrate, magnesium, sulfur, and iodine are extracted, all products that had been sold by Chile throughout the world. On the right, the 1910 and 1935 posters show that the annual tonnage increased to 1,650,000 tons in 1906, and between 1916 and 1920, it reached more than 6 million tons per year. Soda nitrate is suitable for all crops around the world. When fed by this fertilizer, they achieve high yields. In these two posters, Chile's soda nitrate producers emphasize the increased yields for all types of plants grown around the world. At the time, it was the only natural fertilizer outside of guano to have a global reach. Between 1875 and 1930, inventions of fertilizers flourished. Waste from the agro-food industries in cities such as animal black, fish guano, powder, etc., and waste from industry, ammonia from wastewater and coke oven gases, potash slag, etc. Phosphates are exploited in France from 1870. Potash is exploited in Germany from 1881. In the Swedes Birkeland and I in 1900, the German Aubin in 1909 produced chemical nitrogen fertilizers from air nitrogen. Fertilizer producers are multiplying all over the world, and competition is raging, especially with chemical fertilizers from 1920. It was during this period, between 1880 and 1930, that the soda nitrate producers developed their full advertising.
When I went to the National Archives in Santiago, I was impressed by the considerable importance of the fund dedicated to soda nitrate. 300,000 documents are gathered on the extraction, the processing and marketing of the soda nitrate between 1872 and 1981 from the 35 operating companies from Santiago, Valparaiso and London, not counting the previous documents from the former Maritime Department of Bolivia or from the Department of Tarapacá, formerly of Peru. The National Library of Chile has published a complete file on this subject, La Industria del Salitre en Chile, which develops the advertising associated with it. This file is available in Spanish and in English on memoriachilena.gov.cl. I recommend that you read it, since in 10 minutes I can only briefly describe the extent of more than a century of production of soda nitrate. You will see further some of the posters published on that site. The other sources are scattered between the Chilean Nitrate Sales Corporation in New York, museums, public and private archives, collectors from the 47 countries in which Chile sold its white gold.
The London office, which created, printed, and manufactured all advertising, relied on the delegations. In 1914, 17 delegations operated in 29 countries. The delegates had multiple tasks, as seen here on the letterhead. Ensure propaganda, establish experimental research, establish crop trials in farms, organize conferences and publish agricultural treaties, advertise with all media and by all possible means, and provide an agricultural and commercial intelligence service. Without the remarkable work of the delegates, it is certain that the sale of soda nitrate from Chile would never have been so successful. Numerous brochures with results of soda nitrate experiments on all types of crops were published between 1880 and 1935. The soda nitrate producers did not hesitate to invest significant sums for their own pavilions in numerous universal exhibitions. A copy of one of the caravels, which carried out the transport of soda nitrate at the beginning of the 19th century, was even presented in Ghent in 1913. They also had a booth for national or local exhibitions, fairs, and agricultural competitions where delegates systematically participated. A lot of advertising was developed among primary school students. Schools had their own vegetable gardens and teachers taught agricultural basics. Many experiments were carried out there and had given rise to publications. The French delegation gave teachers numerous documents and objects to encourage pupils to tell their parents about this wonderful natural fertilizer. Farmers were given leaflets on proper use of soda nitrate and on specific crops. There were kits to measure soil pH and discs to make specific mixtures according to their needs. There were informational meetings, and technicians also came to see them on their farms. The widely distributed calendars and almanacs in the countryside were another powerful way of reminding them to use soda nitrate. Only the Australian calendar of 1927 deviates from this theme by representing the extraction of the caliche. New inventions have made it possible to manufacture attractive advertising media which could be produced in quantity and thus be widely distributed to a very diverse audience. They had their maximum development between 1890 and 1950. Lithography in 3 colors was invented in 1837. The most attractive of these is the one of the fish guano in La Chèvre of Marseille. The postcard was invented in 1871 by Léon Bénardeau, who lived 35 kilometers from my home. It was immediately adopted worldwide. Delegations used it a lot for 3 different topics: universal exhibitions, fairs, and agricultural competitions, and a step-by-step series of the process of extraction to the marketing of soda nitrate. And lastly, the series of comparisons of the crop yield results with and without soda nitrate. Several identical series were published in the different languages of the countries to which the advertisement was addressed. These postcards of yields cover all crops. Each one shows the place of experiment, the name and address of the farmers who carried it out, and the yields obtained. The poster in Slavic uses these postcards to celebrate the centenary of the use of soda nitrate, that is, from 1830 to 1930. I sneaked in 2 postcards from competitors, synthetic soda nitrate and potassium fertilizer. I'll let you find them. Blotters were invented between 1860 and 1870 and were widely accepted by both advertisers and the public. I'm only aware of these 2 French soda nitrate blotters from Chile, so I put together a collection of blotters from French competitors. We certainly all know of these enameled plates which have resisted the bad weather since the beginning of the 20th century. They are attached to the shop fronts selling fertilizer. The ones from 1910 to 1930 are particularly beautiful because they're real paintings. Those of the 1950s are limited to the sole name of the producer. In the post-war period, they were cheaper to produce. As for the posters, I'll draw your attention to a couple of themes. The soda nitrate producers of Chile have been keen to adapt to the different characteristics of each country so that beyond farmers, the whole population feels more directly concerned. You will easily recognize the countries for which the posters below are intended. However, I've given you an index for the first one that can be associated with several countries. In these posters, we see the same visual marketing techniques used on all the nations.
Conclusion. I think it's important to point out that in recent years, there has been a worldwide awareness of the cultural and societal importance of advertising. These testimonies of the past 50 years of prosperity that Chile has experienced, thanks to its white gold, are thus back in everyday life. To continue on this subject, renovations of external advertising media are undertaken. The municipality of Santa Cruz de Palma in the Canary Islands finished in 2019 the renovation of the mosaic which represents the famous black horse and rider on yellow background, created in 1929 by Adolfo Lopez Duran Lozano. The Chilean government wishes to declare this symbol of Art Nouveau cultural heritage. Let us hope that all these mosaics, paintings, and plaques that represent it are still on many buildings at the crossroads, both in Spain and in Portugal, and will also be restored. While waiting for this happy time, the Black Rider has found a new destiny by adorning t-shirts and sweatshirts. We can thank these young entrepreneurs who give life to the symbol of the miners at the Atacama Desert, who through their extreme work have allowed our farmers to give us abundant and quality food.
I do hope that you survive to my French accent, and I thank you for the attention you have paid to this subject from the other side of the world. François Sigaud, the formerly AIMA president, dreamed of seeing his museum and his agricultural researchers participate in the AIMA. When I am there, I try to create contacts with both of them. While waiting for their very warmly awaited participation, I wish to have created today a third link with this country, dear to my heart, after having presented the Museum of Colchagua as a Chilean bread at the Congress of Marseille in 2014. For the very end, I do want to mention my dear friend Moët Barboff, who had the very bad idea to pass away on March 22nd. I am sure that I am not the only person to miss her.
My name is Anne-Jorunn Frøyen. I'm curator at the Musees, and in this presentation, I want you to join me to the beginning of the 20th century, to the years between 1910 and 1920, when Norwegian farmers started using pesticides to kill insects and fungi and weed. In this decade, farmers had to learn about pesticides, how the spraying equipment worked, how to avoid their harmful effects, and at the same time, they had to have an understanding of both the chemicals and the species the chemicals were targeted at. I'm going to take you to Rogaland County, situated at the southwest of Norway by the North Sea. In the second decade of the 20th century, farmers were growing grain, mainly oat, potatoes, vegetables, fodder for the livestock, and some fruit and berries. Today, as you see, it is grassland. I will talk about how agricultural experts established sites of miracle, camouflaged as outdoor laboratories to persuade farmers to use chemicals, how these sites of miracle were designed and established, and how they worked. The first chemical introduced against weed was iron sulfate. Sulfuric acid and cyanamide came a few years later from 1916. Sulfuric acid became very popular and was widely used in cornfields in Rogaland. This picture is from a textbook from 1911 and shows how the acid were handled in an ideal situation. Sulfuric acid isn't easy to handle. Often, the spraying equipment didn't work properly, it leaked, acid would destroy clothes and cause painful wounds. Therefore, it is not hard to believe that farmers had to be persuaded to make use of these chemicals. Who were these experts or agricultural improvers? They were men. Most of them educated at our Norwegian Agricultural University. On national level, they were two in 1910, one entomologist and one weed expert. From 1919, three, as a state mycologist was hired. They were not isolated in a Norwegian context, but stayed in contact with their peers abroad. At the picture to the right, it is our state entomologist and state mycologist attending a plant protection conference in Copenhagen in 1922. On the left side is a weed specialist in the middle, with his two colleagues in Rogaland County at his side. The text says, "The weed apostle and his two helpers in Rogaland." His title, Weed Apostle, is telling. He was really a missionary in front of the national war against weed. His two helpers got assistance from agronomists in some of the municipalities from 1917. To conclude, there were a network of agronomists working to solve a steadily growing weed problem, a problem caused by the use of more fertilizers, monocultures, and new farming methods. The entomologist was collaborating with a horticulture specialist in the county, dealing with problems due to insect and fungi in vegetable, fruit, and berry production. How did they persuade? Agricultural experts on national level had already initiated collaboration with local farmers to be able to test different plants and seeds. It was necessary, due to Norwegian geography, to explore which plants gave best results under local conditions. Outdoor laboratories where such testing could be done had already existed for several years in Rogaland, and there was also an understanding that by being able to demonstrate what was right and what was wrong, agriculture experts could persuade farmers to change their practice. In 1915, the first test comparing different types of techniques for removing weed were performed in the county. They were designed in collaboration with the national weed expert and based on his knowledge from previous trials. It was a success, concluded the country agronomist. The following year, 5 sites were chosen, scattered in the county, and all of them beside roads where farmers were passing. Masters of spraying were hired, and knowledge on how chemicals and plants were interacting were moved to these sites where an outdoor laboratory was set up. But the intention was not to investigate, it was to design sites for dissemination of best solutions for weed control. Agricultural experts did this by making a theater performance, furnishing the state as a laboratory, and thus making use of science as a warrantor of truth. Our agronomists had earlier experienced how such states were working, and our national weed expert had even experienced that they were particularly successful in these cases. He had seen in other counties that the audiences perceived the chemicals as agents of miracle. However, a laboratory is typically set indoor where conditions are controlled and the people working there are trained experts. This was only pretending to be a laboratory, and things did go wrong. At some sites, there even was more weed growth after spraying than where chemicals had not been used. The explanation was obvious, the experts reported. The spraying master had done something wrong and the weather was not suitable this year. By circulating this as truth, our experts took the cause of failure from chemicals and gave it to the weather and the farmer. By arranging the dissemination like a laboratory, the leading experts were able to present their notions of interactions between cultivated plants, weeds, chemicals, visiting species, and inorganic materials as scientifically proven fact. Their message was perceived as the truth, and it worked. In the years after, more such laboratories were designed and established around the county. At these sites, where experts were stage directors, farmers could drive by, stop, and see with their own eyes what miracles the poisons were able to perform. They could meet peers, like they are doing on this big site in 1964, discuss what they were seeing, conclude, and maybe try the same at their own farm. The results were documented and men placed in the fields to illustrate the effects, and photos were taken. This documentation could circulate to other arenas like textbooks or reports. The pictures is from 1961. Here we see a potato field where Maneb, a fungicide, had been used. The man at the left was standing in the part where the chemicals had been used, the other in the non-sprayed area. The photo is also documenting what they were looking for. How well was the potato plant doing? Other interactions were not seen. Maneb has low persistence. It has a breakdown product which has been found in spinach, carrots, and potatoes. It helps a lot to wash the vegetables. This is not shown in the documentation of this experiment. While earlier courses had been held indoor, farmers later in decennia were invited to join courses where they were visiting farms together with experts. This picture was taken in 45 years later and illustrates how knowledge was circulating on such sites. We see the county agronomist to the other left watching the stage. The thin rope is indicated that this is a field where an outdoor laboratory is constructed. The spraying equipment that the issue is pesticides. The year 1961 and the place grassland indicated that this is a hormone type of herbicides. They are all looking at equipment while a young boy is talking, the solver of the problems. Then to the troublesome insects. The state's entomologist traveled to the West Coast area in the summer of 1913. Here he is studying some apple trees, where growers had been using chemicals against different insects and fungi for several years. Still, insects and fungi did not disappear. The state entomologist was not able to design outdoor laboratories like his colleague, the weed apostle. Insects were unpredictable, and no miracles were shown to farmers. And farmers did not use chemicals to eradicate insects in the fields in Rogaland in the years between 1910 and 1920. Maybe because no laboratories or sites of miracle were established showing how well these chemicals worked.
Well, I hope everyone that is on the Congress live at the moment agrees with me when I say I think this is a perfect session to sum up this Congress when we're talking about past and future agricultures. A wonderful look at the transnational history of agriculture museums from around the world, collaborating and sharing knowledge over many, many decades, and then deeper dives as we were able to have a window into some fascinating research and work going on in Norway and Chile and France. I certainly appreciate very much that there are multiple languages being represented on the panel this morning. And so knowing that, I have put a question that I circulated to our presenters earlier this week. I've put it in the chat en français et en anglais, in French and English. And so what I had asked was if with the, knowing that the topic of this Congress was the past and future agricultures, and that each of you had looked into you know, a local community of topics that resonate with agricultural production or food culture, I had asked our panelists if they could share with us how they think their topics of research or their collections may be interpreted differently or expanded upon over the coming decades as other cultural perspectives, environmental sensibilities, and virtual audiences from around the world interact with their research and their publications. And I'd love to share, if permitted, the response from Abel, which I have translated back into English. And Abel was thinking that two of the questions that he believes will resonate with an increasingly younger and urban audience at the museum in Saint-Lô are related to how people interact with one another, certainly immigration and racism. And the second primary issue would be environment, and that is leading to an evolution on his site, as we saw with the conservatory orchard, and an ability to demonstrate the technology and have a look at some of the heritage varieties of apple trees and agricultural production that those technologies would have been used on. I'd love to open up the same question to Joao and Anne and Marie-Christine. It's so nice to see your faces. I wish it was in person so that we could be sitting down over a coffee and having these discussions. However, when you are looking at your topics, and certainly maybe perhaps, Anne, we could start with you. I am situated, my museum is situated on a national research station that is involved in ongoing science and has been for the last 130 years. You brought up the topic today of the use of pesticide. Do you think that over the coming years, as you have new audiences with different sensibilities, do you think that that will change perhaps how you interpret and share that type of knowledge with your audiences?
Yes, I certainly hope so, that we are able to do something different with this subject. I think a lot of young people are concerned about the use of pesticides. They've all heard about how insects are disappearing, and I think they have a different view on this topic when it comes to the result of this use of poison, both at their own body, but also at the environment. And I think if we are able to take this issue and make something different about it, then we can have a dialogue with the young people. And I was thinking about, like we in this county, they have used a huge amount of sulfur acid. And I think we could do in this museum, sulfur acid isn't forbidden to use. We could just put on a display how it was used, and then use it, and then look at the soil. What happens to the soil when you're using such strong acids on it, and by then making a dialogue? I think that would be a part to start, maybe.
It's a wonderful idea. And Marie-Christine, I'm thinking of your presentation and the richness of the art and the promotion. It was a real snapshot in time, not only of the product of this valuable crop that was quite literally being spread across continents, but that your, the idea of having a cultural history designation and reclaiming some of the art and promotion of the time. Do you think that with the current audiences, do you see that research being applied differently or being understood differently when we look now in hindsight at that use of the fertilizer in the trade at the time?
Yes, there is a new, it will be better in French. Les jeunes maintenant sont très sensibles à l'utilisation des engrais, à l'excès d'utilisation des engrais, et ils se retournent plus vers des engrais naturels tels que le guano, dont la production a repris, mais avec des cycles de 10 ans. C'est-à-dire que les gisements sont exploités pendant 2 mois tous les 10 ans. Et en ce qui concerne le nitrate de soude du Chili, il y a encore un gisement qui est en exploitation à l'Officina Maria Elena. Et je pense que tous les jeunes sont de plus en plus attachés à une utilisation raisonnable des engrais.
So if you'll permit me, Marie-Christine, for our audience's English this morning or this afternoon, I would translate your answer to be that when we look at the types of fertilizers, and it picks up perfectly on what Anne was saying, that there is a growing intensity from audiences to want to understand where their food is coming from, the production values behind that, what types of fertilizers or pesticides have been used in their food production, that there is this return to what is considered a more natural fertilizer or organic way of producing food. When we look back, we do definitely see how the song of the day, how the refinement, how the market demands of the day were certainly influencing agricultural practice, but also consumption. Joao, I'm wondering if you can add to this conversation, if you, as you're doing your research, are finding that there are audiences that are interested in the topic of the transnational history, but from a contemporary context on how we can perhaps share knowledge and exchange and look at these topics for our current key issues of time when we hit issues like food security or sustainability.
Well, my research is mostly focused on the history of the museums themselves. I'm not a museum professional, so I'm learning more than you learn from me. But my impression is that one thing that connects all agriculture museums, or all museums where agriculture is an important part of their displays, is food. Because, you know, people that grow up in cities, I would say that many of them, well, they have more and more and kind of diffuse environmental stress about what's going on, and they know about climate change. They understand the importance maybe of going back to more traditional practices in their perspective. What they think it's traditional is not necessarily what was traditional. But this is very diffuse and disconnected in the last few decades with promotion of new age lifestyles, etc., etc. But the truth is, everyone eats. Everyone around the world needs to eat, and you see that in science museums, in science centers, even private museums of industry. The focus is more and more on food. How to prepare the food? How was it prepared before? How is it produced? And I think this is something that unites all these museums that I've been reading about and over the last few days is food. And I would say that, of course, also food safety. If there's pesticides on it, if it's genetically modified or not. But I would say that in my perspective, this is a very common denominator, both between what unites museums and what people want to see in museums.
Excellent point. Food certainly is a common denominator for any audience. However, your point about food safety, I think, is very salient and will likely be impacting the interpretation and programming at a lot of our museums for the coming years. I'm going to go to the questions in the chat. Marie-Christine from Ollie, he's wondering if you know of other archives relevant to the wider history of the fertilizer. He knows that, for example, the Merle is holding archives that are connected with the Chilean nitrate company, and he's wondering if there is a comparative global history to be made.
The main source of archives are in Santiago de Chile, in the National Archives. They hold 1,300,000 documents. But I know that they still source in New York, because they have an office, publicity office in New York. And I know that in Merle, as Ollie told me, there's a lot of documentation. And I don't know, it will be worth to check in London, in National in Kew, if they are holding more materials. As far as the central office for publicity was in London in those times. So, and it will be worth to ask in all our museums if they are holding some documents about nitrate. In France, some producer as Kuhlmann, as Saint-Gobain, hold their own archives. And it will be, I think, interesting to join all the archives we can find, you know, because I think that in Eastern countries, they must have, and it will be interesting to join as much as we can of those archives. I know that for the pesticide, I found also documentation, and I will try to send to Anne what I found. To join, it will be interesting to join as much to make to have a full subject, you know.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I'll put in a plug for our AIMA colleague, Klaus Kropp, who puts together the blog posts. And I think certainly you have already inserted a collection of posters and images from other countries. I think it might make for a wonderful post and a call to action to other museums.
Yes, it would be interesting. And you have a lot of objects, you know, they produce to appeal the attention of the public, you know. So there is plenty to do.
Wonderful. And there's a question for you from Isabel. She's wondering how you will share your research with museum visitors, if it will go into a display, a documentary, an interactive. I believe you said that there's a production, an exhibition in production.
No, not actually in production. We're going to do it, but we haven't started planning yet. But I'm not sure what I could say, but maybe I could write an article somewhere so you can all hear about it. Well, maybe.
I'm sure our lovely colleague Cosette would love to have an article that would share that, and I do agree that I think you know, the earlier comment on food safety and a desire for more for different audiences, perhaps that haven't visited our museums before, that might be drawn in by these questions of food security and food safety. Pete Watson had a question that he was posing to everyone, but I will ask it to Abel. How often, and Anne, how often are your museums, whether it's your collections or exhibitions, used by agricultural extension services, such as research scientists or educators, to improve future agricultures? Abel?
Yeah, I'm here.
Donc la question c'est est-ce que ça arrive souvent qu'il y en a des autres chercheurs, des autres éducateurs, éducatrices qui utilisent votre collection comme une façon d'improver?
Oui. Yes. Some researchers are coming to Saint-Loup but it's only at the moment researcher about mechanical tractors, mechanical steam engine, all the material. But we have a lot of researchers and writers, book writers in France. They are spending a lot of time in Saint-Loup for some machine to see what happens. It depends of the machine, but you have a lot of books, memory books about tractors like Société Française. We have CAS. We have a lot of archive of the company CAS, an American company, but at the moment, the archive for us, they are in boxes, and we never work on that for the moment. We are just volunteers in our associations, and we have no time to take time to record and to write books and so on. Are you agree with me?
Wait, no, merci. And is the same true for the Musees? Are you seeing that more researchers or educators are accessing your collection?
I wouldn't say so, that more researchers are maybe for our archives, but sadly not for our collection. I don't think so, but I hope, since we are now rebuilding or building a new huge place for our items, I hope so that they will be more interested in it.
Thank you. So I know that we're to wrap up now. I want to give the last word to Joao. There was a question from Ollie at the beginning of your presentation. As a newcomer to AIMA, he's wondering if you can comment on the role that you think as an association, the AIMA can be playing to support agricultural museums and also the audiences when you think of the broader theme of past and future agricultures. Perhaps in your own context or as you're sharing your work with others, what role do you see this association playing when it comes to past and future agricultures?
That's a difficult question for me as a newcomer, as Ollie said. Well, what you can, I guess, continue doing, it's what they have been trying to do since the 1930s or even 1920s. It's to bring together museums that look very different, but down deep, they are working on very similar topics. And for instance, what I notice is they don't have that many museums of science and technology. Maybe yours, I'm not sure, I've never been at your museum in Canada, but I guess maybe yours is the closest one to that you have. But there's plenty of museums of science and technology and science centers that are working on basically agriculture topics. They just don't know about it. But all these agricultural implements we saw in the Abel's presentation, like a microscope is also an agricultural object in the sense, because if you are studying plant viruses, you use a microscope or use a glass house, or and it's also part of agricultural history. So I guess this could be something interesting for the association to focus on, bring more museums into the conversation and see what can what can be done when you cross objects and archives and experts that work on science museums and open air museums and folklore museums. And I guess that this could be very interesting also for the audiences, that they can make connections between different fields.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the entire panel. I do think that the technologies that we have now, we saw that Abel had done some crowdfunding to support some very specific collection work that he was doing. We've seen Anne sharing some pretty amazing images that I certainly would never in my lifetime have been able to see without this type of Congress. And certainly Marie-Christine, what you're working on with your research and comparative analysis on socioeconomic issues It's fascinating. And I do think that if there is a silver lining with not being together and by doing this virtually, is that we are able to share and have these recordings. So I do encourage everyone to, when these are made available on YouTube, to go back. I think there's a lot of rich information for all of us to follow up on. Merci à vous tous. Thank you very much. And I'll hand it back over to Isabel.
Thank you very much, Kerry-Leigh, and thank you to all the panelists for a really interesting session. We're trying to keep to time, and we have our annual general meeting next, but we want to give you a 10-minute break. So in 10 minutes, please come back. And we have a last presentation, which is actually done by me, but is about the work of one of our fellows at Merle, Chris Green. So we'll be back in 10 minutes. Thank you. This presentation is given on behalf of Chris Green, a past fellow at the Museum of English Rural Life. Thank you for watching this. I'm Chris Green, and since 2011, I've been retired and independent. Before that, I was director of St Albans Museums and oversaw the tools collection there. Since the end of 2013, I have worked on a dictionary of farm hand tools and contrivances using Merle's collection and was the Gwyn E. Jones Fellow in 2014. I must quickly add that I haven't been working full-time since then, and I only started writing in 2016. Completion is much to be desired, as is a publisher. Anyone listening? The idea was to follow the work of Raphael Salomon, who produced definitive dictionaries of woodworking tools in 1975 and leatherworking tools in 1986, but died before he could get on to his great love, the farm tools. The result is, even today, if you want to know about old farm tools, then bad luck, albeit they were used every day by most people in England before 1800. 1.7 million of them in 1871, and 1 million before World War I. Roy Brigden's Shire albums cover the ground and are obtainable from Merle. Roy Brigden was a past keeper at the Merle. But if you're looking for something of substance, then you'll get Fossils, the Farmer's Tools, 1950. And as you will see, they are the farmers rather than the farmhands. And so we follow ploughs and bean drills through the ages on their relentless advance to the present day, when most English farmland has been drained and is accessible by 4x4 or quad bike. One man can now farm 1,000 acres in southeast England, and very often does. Rather than a simple dictionary in which hay rick follows hay fork and precedes hay truss, I have now gone back to the farming process pattern, in which we start with breaking the land. A Saxon example is here, circa 1025. And we finish with the harvest and the processing of grain to follow. What have I learnt or confirmed at Merle? Firstly, that most old hand tools were of wood, light, strong, readily obtained, tipped with as little iron or steel as the job required, to withstand the silica in soil or to provide a cutting edge. Before about 1870, the labourer could rehandle a tool by knocking out the nail, cutting a new length of willow, hazel or blackthorn in a hedgerow or on the edge of a wood and refitting. Very few tools can be dated before 1800, simply because the price of scrap iron was so high before the 1870s, and labourers were so poor they had to burn tree roots in the fire. So a worn-out tool made a good glaze, and the iron part could go back to the blacksmith next morning for credit. The price of iron never ceases to surprise. Archaeologists normally forget this and are surprised that so few iron tools are found on sites of the 6th or 7th century, before the Roman Iron Age. Techniques of the body, to use Marcel Mauss's phrase, are important. Why do Brits and Americans use spades when most of the rest of the world uses digging hoes? Sometimes the difference has been little more than where a tool maker has placed the handle in relation to the blade. In other cases, we can record ingenious use of a tool to lighten the work. There is little evidence to show how tools were made and how they reached individual labourers. On the whole, the worker kept the tool, but it belonged to the farm and might be recalled. Witness marks should be carefully looked for on older tools. On the handle of this sieve, which would be accounted a homemade one-off if there were not a picture of one in the Illustrated London News for 1846, can be found the marks of a rounding plane. A specialist tool often used for scythe handles, since its diameter can be altered and the workpiece need not be straight. But at Merle, it is most persuasively seen on a straight rake handles. A specialist tool maker was involved even when adding a forked ash bow to a tool. So the grandfather made all his own tools story is disproved yet again. Even objects which appear well within anyone's capabilities usually demonstrate a visit to the professional, or were simply bought ready-made from him. Yorkshire hay creels for carrying hay on the back or on horseback are very simple constructions, yet the maker was photographed at work in the 1960s. New tool types have appeared. Merle proves to have two rare wooden forks which glory in the name of yelves and were used to carry or lift muck. A yelve is first seen in a comic engraving circa 1520 by a South German, Hans Weiditz, and is carried by a gross peasant with a goiter, a plate, spoon, and wine gourd to show his appetite, and a matching wife. The larger of Merle's forks, made in Northumberland in the 19th century, is very similar. Randall Holmes' Book of Heraldry and the Oxford Dictionary tell us what they were called, and Samuel Palmer drew another, similar to Merle's smaller example, in a barn at Shoreham, Kent, around 1825. And finally, sources. I have tried to be Catholic, and often this is the only way to go. One school of thought says that English practice was driven to the Celtic fringe, i.e. the Highlands of Scotland, to Wales and to Cornwall. Cornwall, not Sussex, is certainly where to find out about the practice of paring and burning, though now probably beyond living memory. Despite the fact that in the 17th century, you could probably have found it in both counties. Merle's yelves come from Scotland and Northumberland, but may not have been made there. There is also the small consideration that Scots historians and the staff at St Fagans in Cardiff do not ignore their agricultural past, as English historians have. And we should not be afraid to look abroad when necessary. The English could not or would not draw themselves before about 1725. But Peter Bruegel the Elder made this magnificent drawing of scythemen around 1560 in Flanders, and it would be foolish to ignore the straight scythe handles and the strickles they used to sharpen the scythes, exactly as we find them in England, and the earliest known representation, not to mention all the people on the right carrying loads on their heads. Back to Britain for an end piece. Thomas Bewick, around 1800, engraved a Northumberland man sheltering from near horizontal snow in the lee of a haystack. If we look carefully, the stack is about an inch across in the engraving. We can see that he also provides the silhouette of the first recorded hay spade, an edge tool for cutting bales, and redundant by 1870. Thank you.
It only really remains for me to say an enormous thank you to you all for coming along to the General Assembly and to our AIMA 2021 Congress. You will have noticed that our last session really served also as our plenary session, and that was kind of purposeful in that I feel we should be taking away from this lots of the ideas and implementing them immediately and trying them out in our own local contexts and sharing and contacting each other and following up and carrying on this conversation rather than having further roundtables to explore and discuss the same ideas that we've discussed so powerfully throughout the Congress. So I hope you'll forgive us not having extra discussion at the end, but I'm sure we'll be reconvening to have amazing follow-up sessions and meetings and discussions in due course. I've really enjoyed the last few days, and I hope you have too. It's been a little bit tiring for me, but it's been an enormous pleasure to have you all on my various screens in my office. So thank you all very much. We're going to play out, I think, with another tribute for our late colleague Muet Barboff, which has kindly been shared by Marie-Christine Aubin just this morning. So we'll play out with that, and Pierre and Marie-Christine tell me that both that and the other tribute video that we shared earlier in the Congress proceedings will be tidied up and titled and formatted a little bit more before we share them again via the YouTube, the AIMA YouTube channel. But thank you, Marie-Christine, for sharing that with us this morning. And I think it feels like a fitting end to our Congress to remember such a wonderful colleague. So thank you all for coming again.
I am Marie-Christine Aubin. This is my tribute to my friend Muet Barboff. At the end of July 1999, I arrived in Vendée at François Sigaud, our former president of the AIMA, for the colloquium on cow dungs which he had organized and which was held in Trieste, 15 kilometers from his home. And who jumps at my neck? But Muet Barboff, a charming, pretty lady whom I had never seen before, but whose name, Siegel, she used to sign her papers, intrigued me. With great enthusiasm, she showered compliments of the paper I had written on the threshing rollers. What started off a serious classroom work session quickly became enthusiastic dance of molding gallets of cow dung mixed with laughter. This was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. For me, Muet represents 20 years of a friendship adding up the passionate and precise knowledge, the permanent enthusiasm for new discovery, the true generosity, the cheerfulness, and the simplicity of a talented woman. Mouette was passionate about bread, this universal food. Her research ranged from all stages such as cultivating the grain in the fields, to that of bread making, to festive bread, not forgetting the daily breads invented in the regions of France and Portugal. All her research, carried out mainly in these two countries, is remarkable for her thorough, detailed, precise and rigorous work. I still enjoy seeing her arrive in the room where her thesis defense was taking place, dragging her shopping trolley. It's unusual, isn't it? She drew from the trolley the 6th volume of her 2,232 pages thesis on the breads of Portugal, from which she wrote the book The Bread of Women, published in 2016. A year ago, on July 18, 2020, during one of our Sunday morning conversations, Mouette was surprised that she never sent me her CV. She sent it immediately. I counted the pages. There were only 30. You will find it in the AFMA letter number 41 of June 2021, where Pierre Del Porto published it. While waiting to read it, you can go on the internet. Here are the first pictures that are displayed, and there are several pages. On the 8th picture of this display is Joaquim, her baker friend who tribute her this video that we saw on Saturday. Mouette invited him to participate in the Bread Festival in Mafra, Portugal, in July 2015. It is one of the 13 exhibitions they organized and participated in Europe. During another conversation, she was telling me lately that she was thinking giving up writing books. It must be said that she published only 11 books in 14 years. 6 of them won national and international awards. She has created 2 associations. The first one, l'Europe Civilisation du Pain, in 1999. The second one, Moleriae, in 2006, following the International Congress on the Grinding Industry she organized in 2002 at La Ferté-sous-Jouarre, assisted by François Sigaud, our former president of AIMA. She was in charge of the AIMA bread workshop. She organized a study trip for the Société d'ethnozootechnie for a week in Portugal. Pierre Del Porto, who participated, will tell you what it went down in history. Personally, I will forever regret not having been able to attend, unfortunately kept in France by my professional activities. She participated in 3 AIMA congresses, the 16th in Slobodia in Romania in 2011, where she was a guest of honor, the 17th in Tartu in Estonia in 2013, the 18th in Marseille in France in 2014. The one that delighted us both the most was the one in 2013 in Tartu, because Mouette loved life and she appreciated good food, as I. We attended the rye workshop. Several speakers brought rye-based food to illustrate what they were saying. Thus, under the rule of the King of Rye Vodka of Estonia, we tasted, on slice of Estonian and Lithuanian rye bread, pork from the Estonian smoke saunas, and French cheese, as the log of Saint-Maur crossed by a straw of rye and the Saint-Nectaire refined on rye straw. For dessert, I made the gingerbread, the true one made from rye flour. Mouette leaves behind an impressive work in addition to her books. 31 papers, 106 lectures at conference, radio broadcast, etc. 1 film, 9 videos, of which 1 is currently screened in the exhibition at Musees in Marseille, Le Grand Musée, whose curator is our colleague and friend, Edouard de Lobry. She was internationally recognized and she had received numerous awards, amongst them 6 Gourmand Awards and Best of the World. On March 19th, passing by Paris, I called to meet her, but she was rushing to a baker's to get 1 more clarification before handing over the proof to the publisher of her book, La craquante et prestigieuse baguette. In 208 pages, in this fundamental work, which was scheduled to be published on May 14, she wrote everything about this symbol of French culture, which we all hope will soon be classified as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity by UNESCO. Over these 2 years of writing, she was swimming in happiness with each of her discoveries on the mysteries of the baguette. She was amazed and rejoiced in it. She was convinced she would receive loads of compliments. I am so sad that she will not be present for the launching and receive them. On the morning of March 22, she handed over the proof to the publisher. At 5 p.m., she took a well-deserved walk with her granddaughter on a beautiful spring afternoon. Struck down by a heart attack, it has been her last walk. Thank you so much, Mouette, for the legacy of your immense work that you have accomplished and generously shared with all of us. Thank you, Mouette, for your friendship, your confidence, your knowledge, and all the fun we have shared. I just want to point out that lying on the fertility stone has had no consequence for our respective beloved children, Boris and Adrien, your sons, and Jean-Baptiste, my son. Bye, Mouette.